Hi, everybody. Today we're going to go over a lesson that will introduce you to evaluating author credibility. This is something that will come up in a few assignments later on, but I wanted to talk about it now while we still have reading one still in our minds. So we're going to use that as an example, and then we will do a little bit more with this as you get into Unit 2 and Unit 4, I believe. All right. So when you think about evaluating an author's credibility, we're looking at who wrote the source that you're reading. And some of the reasons it's important to question and evaluate an author's credibility is to make sure that your information is accurate, you're avoiding misinformation, um, you're forming sound opinions based on the information that you're reading. You're not basing your own opinions on misinformation. You want to avoid bias as much as possible. And eventually, when you're using sources in your own writing, you want to make sure that you're establishing your own credibility by using strong quality sources. And these are just a few of the reasons. So anytime you're reading an article and especially if it's one that you're going to be using in your own writing, you want to look at who wrote that article and what their background is. Now, I'm going to show you a few examples here, and um, you always want to look at kind of the strengths and weaknesses in an author's background. Very rarely are you going to find like the perfect example. So we want to weigh the strengths and the weaknesses, or weigh the strengths against the weaknesses, and make our best choices based on that. All right. So the text, the slides that I have coming up are going to have a lot of text on them. So it's just the best I could do. So let's have a look. Okay. So here's our first one. So Michael Thompson has been a journalist for over 2 decades, covering a range of issues from global politics to local news. Having worked for leading national dailies and broadcasting channels, so this would be like leading national dailies would be like USA Today or maybe the New York Times. Leading broadcasting channels would be like NBC or ABC News. He's covered more than a dozen stories on school violence and safety measures across the U.S. While he doesn't claim to be an expert on gun control or education policies, his meticulous reporting skills, unbiased approach, and knack for interviewing the right stakeholders gives readers a holistic view of the topic. This article, like many others, is a testament to his commitment to presenting every side of the debate. So, if we were doing some research on the topic of arming teachers in schools, that was the sample topic I was working with here. What are some of the strengths and the weaknesses of his background? So he's not an expert on the topic. He doesn't claim to be an expert, but he is a well-respected journalist, and he is known for doing solid research and for presenting unbiased information, right? Um, So, just because he's not an expert doesn't mean I would say, oh, I'm not going to read this article or I'm not going to use this article because he's not an expert. I would make sure, though, that he's citing good sources for the information he provides, because we wouldn't expect him to know off the top of his head information about this topic. So he needs to find the information elsewhere, but based on his background, his career background, we can see that he has proven himself to be a trustworthy reporter. So I think this would be a decent article. If I read an article by this author, I would feel like he's a trustworthy author. All right, here's our next one. Jessica Hart is a passionate advocate for children's safety and community engagement. Her involvement in local community councils and parent groups has allowed her to witness firsthand the fears and concerns of parents and students and teachers regarding safety in schools. A mother of 3, Jessica has spent countless hours researching the pros and cons of arming teachers and believes that every voice should be part of this important conversation. In this article, she shares her personal views, fueled by both Hart and countless discussions with other concerned community members. So, what do you think about her if you were reading an article by Jessica Hart? How trustworthy do you find her as an author? So let's look at some of the strengths and weaknesses. She's clearly interested in this topic. She, has a lot of personal interest in it. We don't really see anything here about her education or career background. So she doesn't really have experience with the research side of this topic. Um, in terms of if I ran across an article by Jessica Hart, I might use it, but I would probably use it to add a balance of types of evidence in my article, because this is where we're going to hear more personal testimony and more descriptions and maybe some, quotations that sort of tell the emotional side of the story versus the logical and factual side. So if I needed that sort of material in my article, I might use Jessica Hart's article to do that if I needed that type of information in my essay. All right. So there's some other things I would look at before I decide whether to use this article or not. But those are the things that I would think about with my looking at the author. And then we have the final one, Dr. Emily Patterson. Dr. Emily Patterson holds a PhD in education policy from Harvard University and has spent the last 15 years researching school safety, gun control, and related policies. She's been a consultant for multiple school districts across the country, advising on safety protocols and crisis management. A former school principal, Emily has written extensively on the topic with over 20 peer-reviewed publications to her name. She's also been a key speaker at international conferences discussing best practices for school safety. In this article, Dr. Patterson dives deep into the data, presents empirical evidence, and lends her expert perspective on the debate surrounding arming teachers in schools. So here we see a very strong educational background in this topic, a strong career background. She has she's a respected expert on this topic in particular. So clearly, in terms of the credibility and authority, Dr. Patterson is kind of the top of the heap here when we look at our three authors. Now, one thing that sometimes happens with these authors who have a very strong level of expertise in the topic, sometimes their articles, if they're writing for other experts, it might be hard for the everyday person like you and me to read and understand her ideas. So that's one of the little caveats I would give you about finding articles that are by people who have a strong background in the topic. So we would keep that in mind. But if we are reading an article by her in a source that was written for an everyday reader and not written for experts, this would be a pretty strong sign of credibility in this author. The other thing that we would see in this one is she would not necessarily have to cite a lot of information because she could base it on her own experiences and knowledge and research. Whereas if we look at Michael Thompson, I think his name was, he doesn't have that expertise, so we would want to make sure that he is telling us where he's getting his information from. Okay? So obviously Dr. Patterson is the, has the most expertise, but we just need to make sure that we can read and understand her ideas. I would say Thompson is in the middle, and then Jessica Hart has the least professional expertise. She has more of a personal interest in it, so we would want to make sure that we're not taking a lot of information from her article as factual evidence, right? So with that in mind, let's look at another example here. I believe it's this one. So one of the things you'll be doing eventually is evaluating the authors and the sources. So we'll talk about that in another lesson, evaluating their credibility. So I have an example here of how that might sound in a paper. This is going to sound very similar to what we just looked at, but there's a little bit more going on in here. And then what we'll do is we'll look at what type of information is included and where we might find that information. And then that will show you what you would want to provide as you look at the credibility of authors for sources that you're reading. All right. So here's another example. It's going to sound similar, as I said. The article was written by Kimberly Kindy, a Pulitzer Prize-winning investigative journalist who was the lead reporter on the Washington Post 2015 Fatal Force Project, which looked at the number of fatal police shootings in America. So this topic was about, I think, police brutality. This project earned her both the Pulitzer Prize and the George Polk Award. According to her bio on the Washington Post page, it doesn't need to be italicized, She holds a Bachelor of Arts in Journalism with an English minor from California State University, Northridge. Due to her education and her extensive background in journalism for both the nation and the Washington, D.C. area, including articles on law enforcement topics, she is a credible author. However, her focus on police use of force may include bias towards the subject of this article, which is related. So I would probably match her up with the Michael Thompson example from the slideshow. She is a well-respected journalist, but she doesn't have particular expertise in, law enforcement, right? She hasn't worked in that field. So I would say that she matches up with the Thompson source. So what are some of the things that we see, the type of information that's presented? We have obviously her name. We have her education. All right, so it says that she holds a Bachelor of Arts in Journalism with an English minor. All right. We see her career history. So she's an investigative journalist. She was a lead reporter for the Washington Post. Her extensive background in journalism for both the nation and Washington, D.C., including articles on law enforcement topics. So her career history, her area of interest, right? We also see awards. And then at the end, and what's really important, we didn't see this too much in the other ones, we see this sentence at the end that wraps things up, that this is where I'm going to see what you think about the author's credibility. So sometimes a mistake that students make when they're doing this assignment, and again, you don't have to do this for reading one, this is just practice, but when you do complete assignments like this in future units, one of the things that you want to make sure you do is have something from you that gives an overall evaluation of the author's credibility. So sometimes what students do, and this is where I was going with that mistake, is that they just list all these elements and then they just leave it at that. And they don't answer that question, so what? All right. So after you've gone through and you found their career background, you found their education background, and the awards that they've won, and the other special recognition that they've earned, and you do all that, then you need to make sure that you answer that question, so what? What does this mean about their credibility? What are the strengths and weaknesses of their credibility as an author? The other thing you want to make sure that you're doing when you're looking at their background and you're listing that information from their background is that you're only listing what's relevant to what you're doing. So an example is, I'm trying to think, one of the articles we use, and the students found information about the author and found out that he was like an Eagle Scout, a Boy Scout. And it just didn't really seem relevant to what they were trying to show about this author, right? So we don't have to list every single thing that we find out about them. We just want to focus on their education, their career history, their area of research interest, writing interest, any awards, other special recognition. And then an overall evaluation of credibility, strengths, and weaknesses. Okay? Now, where do we find this information? Here they say that they found it on this author's bio on the Washington Post page. So sometimes you will see on the article, the author's names might be linked, and that link will take you to a bio page on that website or whatever. All right. And that actually does happen with The Enduring Power of Print, Learning in a Digital World. If we look at them, here we go. if we click on Patricia Alexander, why is this so big? Oh, there we go. You can see that she has a very, very detailed bio on this page. All right. When I read through this, it reminds me a little bit of our example of Emily Patterson. Okay. So she has a PhD in reading from the University of Maryland. Her area of research is literacy and reading comprehension. So this is the article that was about whether we comprehend when we're reading on screens or not. Learning and academic development, critical and relational reasoning, epistemic beliefs, and expertise. But we can see that she has a research focus on what the topic of this article. She's been a professor for decades in the education department. Here's some honors and awards she's earned. Now, again, you wouldn't have to necessarily list all these. You could just say something like she's received several awards for her research in literacy and educational psychology. Here's some more recognitions and awards. Here's some leadership roles that she's held in some professional organizations, national professional organizations. Here's her publication history and presentations. She's presented over 400 invited addresses or papers at national and international conferences. So she's such an expert that people ask her to come and talk to their talk at their conferences about these topics. And then there's a little bit more here, some editing and more leadership roles. All right. So like I said, I think I would put her on par in terms of her level of expertise and her credibility with the Dr. Patterson example from the slideshow. Very high credibility here. Okay. So, and then you would wrap it up with something like based on her education, her career background, her many honors, and the respect others have for her. Dr. Alexander seems to be a credible author for this article on reading comprehension while reading on screens. Okay. Now this one had the other author, and when that information that you would include, you would say according to her bio on the conversation. She seems to be credible, right? The other author we had is this Lauren Singer Trackman. I can't say her name. At the time the article was written, she was a PhD candidate, so she was a doctoral student. And since then, it seems like she's earned her PhD because now she's an assistant clinical professor. Her research interests include the nature, context, and underlying process of text-based learning. So at the time, she was a PhD candidate, and you could talk about her research interests being in comprehension, all right, text comprehension. So she doesn't have the background that Dr. Alexander has just yet. They were probably working together. She was probably one of Dr. Alexander's students at the time. Okay. So what we would do here is we would list the information that we have about the two authors. We would say where we got it from, so their bio page on the conversation website, and our overall evaluation of their credibility. And that's what you will be doing for a couple of our other articles we'll be working with this semester. So you can practice with this one if you want to. Sometimes we don't have that much information about the author on the bio page for that particular publication. So that means that we might need to Google them. Some of them, especially if they're experts and well-known, there might be a Wikipedia page on them. And this is a place where Wikipedia would be an okay source to use. Sometimes we'll find a bio for them on another publication, another website. So that might happen also. So you might have to do a little bit of digging, right? But that's what's to be expected, just to look up who the author is and what their background is, and how much we can trust what they have to say about the author or about the topic. Okay, I hope that helps. Again, we'll be revisiting this in later units, but this is just a little introduction to it. All right, take care.